Welcome back to Nifty 50 Photographers. Now in today's video, I'm going to show you how you can turn a simple snapshot into something that looks more like a fine art masterpiece. Now at the weekend, I went to a place called St. Bees. Now it wasn't a lovely, calm day like it is in these little video clips. It was actually very windy. And I went up there and I just literally only had a few minutes to grab a snapshot. So I'm going to show you how I turn this into this. So I took this shot of a guy running into the sea to have a quick dip, and I was thinking about, in terms of framing, that I've got the headland in the background, I've got some sky, and I'm already thinking about what will happen when I develop this image, because I'm going to blur a lot of that, take a lot of the noise out. So the first thing I do is do some very basic development in Lightroom, and I literally just usually do something like auto exposure, add a tiny bit of dehaze and level up the image. I'm also going to crop it because I'm going to finish up with a 16:9 image. Now there's one other thing I want to do with this image, and that's the guy going into the sea is really the thing I'm most interested in. So I'm just going to make sure he pops out a little bit more from the background. So what I've done is I've chosen a brush, a masking brush, and I've just lifted the shadows and the exposure, just a very subtle amount, just to make him stand out a bit more from his background. After I've done all that, I'm going to take my image into Photoshop. So you simply select Photo, Edit in Photoshop. Now if you're not familiar with the processes I'm using, I suggest you go back and watch my earlier video where I go through this whole process in detail and show you the screen recording of what I'm doing. Because in this video I'm just literally going to show you the screenshots. So it should make it a bit quicker and easier to see what's going on, but if you're not familiar with using these tools, then go back and watch one of those. So the first thing I'm going to do, now I've got it in Photoshop, is to select my swimmer. I have made a very rough selection just using the polygonal, that's not an easy word to say in a video, lasso tool. And it doesn't matter, I'm not worried about the edges of this or anything, I'm just doing a very rough selection. So that's my first selection. Once I've got that, so I'm going to copy and paste that onto a new layer with a layer mask. The next thing I want to do is I want to select a bit of the reflection of the sky on the beach, just to give the image a bit more realism. So again, I'm going to do a very rough selection using the same tool, and I'm going to paste that also onto a new layer. Once I've done that, I'm just looking at the overall image, and I think I would like to keep a couple of the people in the background. So I'm going to keep this guy with the red coat. I'm also going to keep this lady and her baby. So same process again, select those and copy and paste them onto a new layer. So once I've got all those selected and on their respective layers, the next thing I'm going to do is go back to my background layer, and I'm going to eliminate them from the scene. But I'm not just going to cut and paste them out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the patch tool and replace them with some surrounding bits of the scene that look very similar. So it's like they were never there in the first place. So simply draw around them with the patch tool, move that slightly to the right until you've completely got rid of them. And you should end up with a scene that looks something like this. So once I've got all that, remember to deselect, and now it's time to apply some blur. And I'm going to use the path blur tool, which you'll find in the blur gallery menu. Once I'm happy with the level of blur, and you can play with the amount, I usually set it quite high, something like 400 or 500 pixels, almost to its limit. I don't use the center blur option, I use the taper blur because I prefer that, because it leaves some of the edges of the scene still in place. And I play with the speed a little bit, but I don't usually go much higher than 25%. Once I've done all that, I commit to doing the blur, and then I can go back and have a look with all the other elements of the scene visible. And you can see it's a bit ugly at this stage. It's got some sharp edges around my selections because I didn't do those very carefully. But what I'm going to do now, if there's a layer mask, I will paint round the subject with a brush to blend those rough edges into the scene behind. And the beauty of a layer mask is, if you make a mistake, you just switch your brush from black back to white, and you can paint it back in, and that's why I generally prefer doing it with layer masks than just cutting and pasting the image and then trying to blend the edges. Now I'm going to treat the reflection of the clouds in the water slightly differently. So I'm going to select that and actually apply another blur filter, which comes straight from the blur menu, and that's motion blur. Now you've got to make sure you do it in the same direction as the original blur you applied in the path blur, otherwise it'll just look odd. And then just slide the pixel slider up until you get something that looks like it's blended nicely into the background, but still retained a little bit of detail that you wanted to keep. So you can see my settings here. I'm happy with that and I'll commit to it. And now I'm getting very close to my final image. So what I'll do with this next is take it back into Lightroom and work on it in Lightroom and just give it my personal feel or personal touch to it, apply my style. And the first thing I do is select a color profile, and in this case I've chosen Modern 4. You don't need to apply it 100%, you can apply it a bit less, and I've toned it down a bit and it's something around 70-80%. And then I've gone through and done the development, and you can see the settings that I've applied. See, I've played with a lot of the exposure settings. I've set a medium contrast curve. I've done some work on the hue, saturation and luminance, and done some color grading. And finally I've applied a little bit of a vignette, and I've also played with the calibration of the colors as well, because I just wanted to emphasize some colors more than others. And that's my final image, and here's the original. It's just one way you can interpret a photograph in a different style, and sometimes it's fun to play with and it helps develop your creativity. I hope you've enjoyed that, and go out and have some fun with your own camera, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.